Porn in grade school? My next guest will tell you everything you didn't know about what's happening in our classrooms. Welcome back to another episode of Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain. This is the show where we talk about anything and everything and whatever is on my mind, and often we're thinking about some of the same issues. Today, we're going to be talking about sex education in schools. Doesn't matter whether it's a public school or a private school, I think many of you will be shocked by what your children are receiving in the classroom. Our guest today is Joi Wasill. She's the Executive Director of Decisions, Choices, and Options. She's going to tell us about all the things we need to know about what's happening in our schools. Welcome, Joi.
Thank you so much for having me today, Dr. Swain. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you know, I'm a public educator by trade and profession and spent many years in the classroom, and then launched out to start an organization serving public and private schools, as you mentioned, with abstinence-based sexual risk avoidance education materials. And I began in 2002, so almost 20 years ago. And what I've observed over the years has been nothing less than shocking. I noticed in probably the early part of the Obama administration that the focus on sex education had changed dramatically in large suburban and rural areas, not so much, but in the large urban cities, particularly here in Nashville.
Okay. And Joi, when you talk about abstinence education, that's something that there was a lot of pushback. Can you talk a little bit about the reception you received back in 2002 when you started your organization?
You know, really there wasn't a lot of pushback in 2002. We were in all of the schools of Metro Nashville. We were in the surrounding counties because the teachers in the classroom know that that's the very best choice for their students. They're the ones dealing with those who are experiencing teen pregnancies and watching the dropout rates. They're the ones dealing with firsthand, right on the front lines, with the kids who are suffering from emotional abuses and sexual abuses. So they loved the messages that we were teaching. However, I did notice in the early part of the Obama administration, 2008-9, that things were changing. Planned Parenthood became a very focal part of the urban school districts. And even here in the Bible Belt in Nashville, Tennessee, they were teaching graphic sexuality and using anatomically correct models to show students how to have safe anal sex.
I know, I remember that.
Yes, I know you were on the front lines of that as well.
Well, it had to do with his appointment of the officials for the Department of Education.
Yes, Arnie Duncan was the Secretary of Education. And he brought in the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network to most all large city schools, and that kind of filtered out and spread out through the other areas of the states. And what we noticed was that in Chicago public schools, in Los Angeles, and New York, and Baltimore, the really radical sex ed that was basically promoting what we see now in almost all schools, which is the sexual orientation, gender identity, and certainly all of the information about how to use condoms for various types of sex, not just heterosexual sex. And so, you know, our children, what I've realized over the last 10 years specifically, our children are at ground zero in this culture war. And we are losing. The latest Barna statistic says that only 4% of today's generation, Gen Z as they're called, has a biblical worldview.
Right, and you're mixing a lot of things there, and so that is an issue for the churches.
Oh, it absolutely is.
That's a problem. But when it comes to the Obama administration and their sexual agenda, many parents don't know that Gleason and organizations like that they are providing sex ed materials to public and private schools. And they have made a lot of headway, and they have, age-appropriate, supposedly, education for kids as young as kindergarten they're teaching them about sex and touching their body parts.
Exactly. And I think what's shocking to me is that parents have become very aware, and I don't know if it's because of COVID and virtual schools, but they've become very aware of the CRT, the critical race theory, that's being taught in almost all schools across the country, not just in the northern cities, but everywhere. But they're not as aware of comprehensive sex ed as it filters in through English language arts curriculum in grade school. Wit and Wisdom is used here in Tennessee, and there's a lot of controversial material in that curriculum. And then there's a book called It's Perfectly Normal that I know you're very familiar with that shows graphic sexual imagery and poses and positions to children ages 10. And so parents that's my call to action, really. I would really appreciate if parents would do what the public school teachers have been telling me for years. I wish the parents would not be their child's buddy, but be their parent and take back control of what their children are learning, whether it's in public school, private school, or even in some cases in church settings.
Right. And this thing about, you mentioned critical race theory. Mm-hmm. What people don't understand is that critical race theory is one of many critical theories. Mm-hmm. They all have Marxist roots.
Yes.
And so there is a, critical queer theory, critical feminist theory. All of these critical theories have the same agenda, the destruction of the family and our institutions.
Exactly. And it was surprising to me to realize that people think this is a new phenomena, that this ideology is new, and it's actually 100 years old or more.
Which one?
All of these ideologies.
Right, but they were at universities and colleges, and so it's new to the public and private schools, so it's new to many parents. But yes, it's been around and it's been seeping in for many years.
Yes. I did some research on Wilhelm Reich. He is a psychoanalyst and a radical Marxist who is from Austria, and he was kicked out of his country in the 1920s. He immigrated to the U.S., and he actually is the one who coined the phrase sexual revolution. And his belief was that in order to have the perfect Marxist socialist utopia, you had to destroy some things. You had to destroy the family unit. And he believed that if you could increase sexual perversion and sexuality among all people, that you would have fatherless children. And fatherless children don't go to church. And so therefore you meet his end game goal, which is to destroy religion.
Right.
And with only 4%, according to Barna, having that worldview, it's a very scary place that we find ourselves in now to think, did he win?
Well, I would say that right now the political left and the progressives, they have the upper hand. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the American people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or people with no political affiliations, I still believe they have values and principles, and that many of them are unaware of what's taking place in the schools as well as in the culture around them. And so, they're losing their children because of their ignorance, but right now there are too many people who are unaware.
I agree. And sadly, National Vital Statistics released the suicide numbers for youth ages 10 to 24, and it's increased over 60% from 2007 to 2018.
I can see that.
We clearly have a generation in crisis.
And I think that some of the issues that young people are confronted with today, like if they're teaching, transgenderism to kids in kindergarten and telling little boys that they might not really be a boy, or little girls, you might not really be a girl, that creates all kinds of angst that we didn't experience as children. Adolescence, that was always hard when as you reach puberty, but to expose kids, as young as kindergarten, to some of the sexual materials and ideas that are being planted in their heads, I mean, that is a form of child abuse, I believe.
Oh, I agree with you, absolutely. And I believe that when parents become aware of exactly what is being taught, as we've seen even here locally in some school systems where parents have become awake, if you will, to what their children are learning, and they're gathering in large groups to challenge the school board that is allowing this information to be taught. They're asking their state legislators to pass laws to stop some of the radical information or the practices of giving children cross-sex hormones so that they can change their gender. So I think parents are slowly waking up on what's going on the sex education front, and that's a good thing because we're past time for that to happen.
We'll be back after this word from our sponsor.
Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain is made possible by Cooper Steel, a family-owned business that provides the steel fabrications for some of the greatest buildings across the United States. 60 years ago, Kenneth and Faye Cooper founded their company in Shelbyville, Tennessee.
Cooper Steel believes in sponsoring Carol Swain because we believe as she does, you build strong, you stand strong.
What started as a vision and now a nationally recognized and operated company that remains true to its founders' Judeo-Christian values and principles. Cooper Steel is committed to excellence, responsibility, and community. Cooper Steel's motto is, build strong, stand strong. They treat their employees and customers like family. Thank you to Cooper Steel for standing strong with Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain. Learn more about our generous sponsor at coopersteel.com.
I'm back with my guest, Joi Wasill. Joi, all of this stuff about what's happening with sex education is so disturbing. How did this happen? When did it get started in America?
It actually began with Wilhelm Reich in the 1920s and his radical Marxist beliefs about sex and religion and how that inhibited and was a barrier to the ideal socialist utopia. But then Alfred Kinsey, many may not be familiar with him, he was a biologist and a very disturbed man at Indiana University, and he began doing sex research on infants, toddlers, and prison inmates. And if your viewers want to know any more about him, you can look up the children of Table 34 and Alfred Kinsey, and they can learn some very disturbing information about who he was. He's known as the father of modern sex education.
Right.
And so in the 1960s, Planned Parenthood and SICA, Sexuality Information Education Council of the U.S., got together, and with funding from Playboy and many other very radical groups, they began producing en masse comprehensive sex education based on the findings of Alfred Kinsey.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we discover that a lot of his experiments and his research that he had actually fabricated?
Yes.
Parts of it?
Yes. Yes.
Which parts in particular?
He used, as I said, prison inmates to determine that homosexuality was a natural instinct, and they were not given the opportunity back in those days because they were all men in
Right.
prison cells. And he was encouraging and filming them. So he didn't use a typical scientific research method to conduct any of his research.
You know, one of the things I discovered recently was that a man by the name of John Money, who was the person that came up with the idea, he was a sexologist of gender identities in the 1950s. And so when people talk about gender identity and sexual orientation, all of that got started back in the 1950s. And we find today that people will use, instead of saying male, female as biological sex, they'll use gender identity as if these are synonyms, and it's not.
Absolutely.
And that's why people can say that there are, 150 genders, because they're not talking about the same thing. With gender identities, it can be unlimited.
And what you said earlier is really true. Imagine being a middle school student today and being taught that there are 150 genders and encouraged by a curriculum that's in your child's school to explore those genders. It's very confusing, and there is no absolute truth anymore. We don't accept that there is truth that says biologically there are two sexes, two genders, male and female. We don't accept that anymore. And I say we, I'm talking about culture and in education. And then when you have the origins of the World Economic Forum creating a new educational ideology known as social emotional learning,
right,
very deceptively marketed as meeting the students and the children where they are emotionally, culturally, socially. And that is the umbrella ideology that critical race theory, comprehensive sex ed, and sexual orientation, gender identity, all of those curricula live underneath the umbrella of social emotional learning.
I discovered that recently, and other people also digging in and noticing how these things connect. The teachers' unions, how much of this comes from their agenda?
Well, it's completely their agenda, the NEA and the AFT. They are pushing an agenda that is contrary to American history. They're pushing anti-American beliefs on our children, and they're pushing dangerous materials onto our children. That's what they support.
Well, do you think that they sincerely believe that this will help our children and that they are helping to develop, you know, not the character of the children, but maybe they have a different definition of character. But, you know, if we were giving them the benefit of a doubt, what do you think their end game is?
I think the upper echelon of both of those organizations know what the end game is. And I think they're in complete agreement with the World Economic Forum because it's a globalist agenda. It is to take down the American tradition of Judeo-Christian values, and they are aligned with that. There's proof with their support base. I don't think the average classroom teacher believes that any of this is good for the children. I really believe, from what I know of the classroom teachers that I interact with, they're very concerned about the state of the mental health of the children because of COVID and the shutdowns and the doctrine and the curriculum that's being pushed on them. I think the average American classroom teacher is very disturbed by all of this.
I know that I'm disturbed by the fact that our society no longer protects children. Exactly. And so you have these situations where, you know, couples, maybe two lesbians, will adopt a little boy, and then they will announce that their little boy is really a little girl, and so they start dressing, you know, the little boy as a little girl. And in many states, they are able to begin the process of, you know, transgendering that child by giving them puberty blockers and hormones and things. I guess puberty blockers are hormones, but preventing the child from developing naturally as they would without this intervention. And we know that it leads to sterilization as well as later, if the child decides that they're going to get a sexual reassignment, mutilation of the body.
Absolutely. We were talking with a man from rural Tennessee who was upset that his son, who is in second grade, came home from school one day toward the end of school this last semester in May, and he shared with his dad when he got in the car, he was crying. And he asked him what was wrong, and he said, well, we had a party at school today for my friend, let's say his name was Joe, and Joe is deciding to be a girl, and so I can't call him Joe anymore, and he's my best friend. I don't want him to be a girl. And this second grader was torn up, and his dad was like, what do I do to help my child understand all of this confusion? And so it's happening all over the country,
But Joi, these ideas are so complicated, and so you started your organization many years ago about abstinence education, and here we are dealing with issues that none of us ever imagined. And so when we return from break, I want you to talk with the parents about what they can do.
Okay.
We'll be back after this break.
Dr. Carol Swain's Be the People, a call to reclaim America's faith and promise, newly released in paperback and audio with a new introduction, is a challenge to all Americans. If you are serious about being the best citizen you can be, this is the book for you. From addressing moral relativism to reclaiming the future, you'll understand why Dr. Swain is one of the most relevant voices in today's culture war. Are you ready to reclaim America's faith and promise? Purchase at bethepeoplenews.com/books or wherever books are sold.
The Biden administration's executive order on immigration brings to the forefront one of the most volatile issues of our time. In this timely second edition of Debating Immigration, I join my voice to that of other experts to provide you with facts and information that will help you understand what is at stake for our nation. This edition offers 21 original essays that cover race, religion, economics, human smuggling, and civil rights.
Purchase at bethepeoplenews.com/books or wherever books are sold.
We're back with my guest, Joi Wasill, and in this segment, we're going to talk about what you as a parent can do to protect your child. Joi.
You know, the teachers in the public and private schools have long said to us when we go in to deliver our abstinence sexual risk avoidance education programs that they wish that the parents could see and hear what their children experience throughout the day during school, and to know that they are critical in their child's development. And I think sometimes what happens, and I'm saying this from a former public school teacher, but also someone who was very active in my church student ministry program, I think sometimes parents believe that once the child gets to a certain age, middle school or high school, they really don't have as much influence over the topic of sex education, and they're embarrassed to talk about it. It's a very difficult subject. Every parent I know dreads the sex talk with your child, and they think it's a one-time thing. You sit down and tell them the birds and the bees story. You take them on a weekend retreat, did that, it's all good. When they really need to be having daily and regular conversations, because their child is being confronted with these issues every day at school, whether it's in class, in the lunchroom, or just in conversations with their friends.
And Joi, I know as a conservative Christian, and we're living in the Bible Belt here in Tennessee, what about the parents who are not Christians? How do they respond to the sexual education? Do you ever hear from them?
We do. Actually, we have teachers who are not conservative Christian people share with us how important they think that our programs are, because again, as I said before, they're on the front lines. They see that these decisions sexually that children make have long-term life consequences that they're just not old enough and their brain isn't developed fully to make when it comes to bringing a child in the world, or certainly with these issues of gender and choosing a different gender. You know, most children aren't allowed to choose their medications they're going to take when they go to the doctor. And most schools are not allowed to administer any medications.
And we know that some of the teachers are predators themselves, because we hear about these teachers being involved with their students.
And that is true. That does happen. That is absolutely true. And I think it goes back to our universities and colleges and the radical agendas that began infiltrating colleges in the 1960s have fully consumed the college experience now. CRT has been taught there forever. Gender identity has been taught in colleges. So I think those teachers are now filtering from college into the classroom. So yes, there is a level of concern with the ideology and background of many teachers. But we hear really that the most overarching theme is that children need their parents' input and oversight. And they really need to do that now, because with the advent of social media and every child having a cell phone and a smartphone in their hand, you know, they're accessing information 24/7 that most of the time the parents have no idea what their child is listening to or watching and who's speaking into their heart. So we wanted to create something, and COVID allowed us the opportunity to see how we could provide a program for parents to be able to take back this concept of teaching sex education to their children.
So what do you have there?
We have a program that is a digitally delivered online resource. It's called Life Choices, Parental Guidance Necessary. Remember back in the day when movies had the PG rating? And,
yes.
And my mom, when I was under the age of 16, I think, never let me go see a PG-13 movie. But we need to remind parents that your guidance is incredibly important to what your child understands about sex and gender and marriage. And so this is a biblical resource. There are 6 series of videos that are done by professional educators, and they're amazingly well done. And you don't have to be the know-it-all on everything sex education, because those individuals are going to teach your child the information. And then we have this workbook, an activity journal, that takes your child through biblically from Genesis, how God created male and female, how God designed marriage and relationships, and then sex. Unfortunately, in the church today, we have children in our student ministries and college ministries that have no concept of the biblical order of creation.
Oh, I'm sure. Now, this resource, how are you getting it to parents? Through the churches or through some other way?
We're working with a lot of churches, and we are marketing it online. It's on our website at dcoinc.org, and you download everything to your computer. So once you download it, you own it, you have it. It's a very nominal fee of $55. We priced it very low because we wanted every parent and grandparent or guardian of children to be able to access it regardless of their income or socioeconomic background. And so we priced it very low because we wanted people to be able to access it.
Now I have another question. Could you take the ideas and concepts and rework them so that they would be acceptable, to a secular audience? Like if you wanted to get that into the public schools, is there a way that you can take those concepts and put them in a form that they would reach, everyone, including, your atheists?
We have that already in our DCO programs, because all of our programs are secular based because we deliver them in public schools. We do not discuss the issue of gender in our classroom presentations. We would not be allowed, due to the current administration's rulings and decrees and executive orders, to say anything contrary to what the national culture is. But we do teach the children healthy relationships. We talk about healthy versus toxic relationships. We talk about the impact of sexual activity prior to marriage. And that covers any gender. If someone is in a homosexual relationship, their best outcome is still to remain abstinent.
Yes.
Because of disease spread among that population, because of the emotional damage that getting sexually involved before you're fully developed and know who you are is such an imprint on your trajectory in life. So we want students to hear that the message of abstinence crosses all spectrums. And so we do teach that in our programs. We have middle school programs and 2 high school programs that we teach in public schools, private Christian schools. This was specifically designed to give the biblical foundation of these issues as children are dealing with them now. And it's recommended for parents of 6th graders and up to go through with their children, and it's going to be a all-in resource. Everything you would want your child to know about God's design is in here.
And Joi, would you tell our viewers how they can learn more about you and your organization if they would like to help support it?
Oh, absolutely. We are a donor-based organization. We're a small nonprofit, 501c3, and we depend on the generosity of churches and individuals to send donations in. You can go to decisionschoicesandoptionsinc.org, or you can just type in dcoinc.org, and it'll take you right to our website. You can watch videos, you can see who we are, and learn more about what we do in the schools.
Joi, thank you so much, and I appreciate all the support you've given me as far as my own work, and look forward to following you and seeing the impact of your program. Our children need it, our parents need it, And God knows our churches need it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We'll be back after this word from our sponsors.
For those of you who would like to know what exactly our children are facing in their education system, this is a must-read book. It will equip you and prepare you to make decisions about your child's health, about your child's education. So I want to encourage every one of you to grab a copy of Dr. Swain's book and join with me and Carol on the front lines in this critical time to eradicate the liberal abduction of our children.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Conversations. We've been dealing with a pretty heavy topic, the sex education and indoctrination of our children. It's taken place in public and private schools. Some of this has even reached into your Christian schools. And parents have to be equipped. They have to understand what's taking place. And so I hope you enjoyed this show with Joi Wasill, and that you will go to her website, and that you will make sure that you are fully equipped to support your child and protect the children of America. Hope to see you next week.